form of matter is. So if you take Anatomy 1, and they're going to say actually there's 4 forms, and it's true that plasma is considered a 4th form. Simple concept, simple enough concept. If you think about water, it comes in an ice cube, it comes in a liquid form that we drink, and obviously if you heat it up, we turn it into water vapor. And so obviously we have the ability of physically changing matter. We can, like I said, we can take an ice cube, melt it, it becomes fluid, put it under heat, or put it over heat, and we can turn it into a gas. We constantly change matter in the body. We're going to talk about scenarios, for example, where we take food in the digestive system. And we take that solid food, we put it into the stomach, and we turn that food and the matter contained within it into a liquid. So we do this throughout, we do this in anatomy all the time. Energy, on the other hand, is our ability to do work. When we think of energy from a chemistry standpoint, we tend to think of it more as a physical energy, i.e. somebody's running, or somebody's talking, or somebody's doing some physical activity, as opposed to what really happens in the body is that we have multiple forms of stored energy. All right, what's the quintessential stored energy of the body? Fat. Fat is the best example of stored energy. So if you have a little something somewhere where you don't want it, it's not really fat, it's just stored energy. You might potentially use it someday to do some work. Kinetic energy is energy that is ultimately in motion. So if you think about a kid running, or you think about some physical activity that's taking place, that's an example of kinetic energy. As opposed to potential energy is energy that's stored up to be used. So if you have if you're thinking about a race, as those runners line up and they're in that static position, ready to go, their muscles are contracted. That's a potential energy. The minute the gun fires and they start moving, they're turning that potential energy into kinetic energy. We do that in the body all the time. The foods that we eat, going back to the digestive system, the foods that we eat are all examples of potential energy, because as we're eating them, they're not actually doing anything for the body. But once we absorb them and we put them into our bloodstream, and then in our bloodstream we put them into our cells now take that energy, take those materials, and do something with them that's a physical or a kinetic energy. So we're constantly doing that in the body, and we're going to see examples of that as we move along through the semester. When we think about the different forms of energy, things like chemical and electrical, mechanical and radiant. Chemical energy is energy that's stored in chemical bonds. Again, a best example for this one is going to be our digestive system. We eat things, the foods that we eat, whether it's carbs, whether it's fats, whether it's proteins, minerals, vitamins, we ultimately utilize those and create chemical energy. We allow that to give our cells the necessary ingredients that it needs to be able to use the chemicals for some form of energy. Electrical energy. This is energy that results from the movement of charged particles. In the human body, there's 2 very good examples of organ systems that create some sort of energy from something electrical. What would those 2 organ systems be? Nervous system, that one should be obvious, right? What's the other one? Muscle. Muscles and neurons. So muscle tissue and nervous tissue, those cells are able to contract or fire. That's a good example of electrical energy. Mechanical energy. This is the energy that's directly involved in moving matter. The best example of this is going to be muscle. Once we electrically cause a muscle to contract, those contracted muscles will physically move something. And whether it's our skeleton with skeletal muscle, whether it's our heart as we're contracting our heart, whether it's our blood vessels or organs as they're moving material within. And then radiant energy is the energy that travels in waves. What would be the best example of an organ system that utilizes radiant energy? There's really only one good example.
Would it be like peristalsis or stomach?
Peristalsis don't get me wrong, it's a good one, but that's mechanical. Now you're talking about some physical motion. Peristalsis is the physical contraction and motion that occurs in hollow organs. So that would be a good mechanical energy one. What organ system utilizes something and the electromagnetic spectrum. Now we're thinking about light energy, things of that
It's
nature.
gonna be your skeletal for
Your
X-ray?
skin.
Skin. Can I put this here? That's on your way.
In the front?
Skin. As the UV rays hit our skin, the fact that we tan, that's an example of radiant energy. Or the fact that we can turn sunlight and help us to produce vitamin D. That's an example of radiant energy. So all of these energy types, the human body does use in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And again, like I said, we are able to convert. Just like we can convert matter as we do, we're able to convert energy as well. The most common that we're gonna see, and we're gonna see this time and time again as we go throughout all the different organ systems, is that we convert chemical potential energy, the food that we put into the body, and we turn it into ATP. What is ATP?
Adenotriphosphate.
Adenosine triphosphate. And what is adenosine triphosphate in the body used for?
Energy.
It is the way that cells do work. If a cell has to do some energy, and do some activity rather, and it requires energy, the form of energy that our cells will use is ATP. And one of the main reasons why we even eat in the base case is so that we can provide sugar for our cells. And once that sugar is in the cell will convert it to ATP. So a good example of how we convert energy in the body. Ultimately, our body is made up of a series of elements. These are the fundamental units of matter. Do not memorize all of these. I'm about to show you a whole bunch of different elements. Some of them are making up the huge portion of our body, like these four here, and then some are trace. Do not memorize the percentages and all that stuff, because I'm never going to ask you about them. These next couple slides are really just more FYI. So when you think about the human body is primarily 96%, according to your book, made up of four key elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And if you look at a periodic table, which we have over here, you can see all the different elements of the body. Other elements in the body that we're going to talk about in great detail, things like calcium. We're going to talk a ton about calcium, especially when we get to the skeletal system, when we get to the muscular system. Calcium is going to be a huge one we talk about, because we use this for a whole host of different functions in the body. Potassium, as we get into the nervous system and the muscular system. And we usually consider these to be called minerals. These are our minerals: the calciums, the phosphorus, the potassiums, the sodiums, the sulfurs, as well as sodium, chlorine, magnesium. We're going to talk about each of these elements as we go along in this semester with different organ systems, because we use each of these elements that are not the big four. We use a lot of these elements for different bodily processes. So for now, you don't have to know much about them at all. But as we get into the semester, we're going to see more and more how these elements are used in the body. Ultimately, elements are made up of atoms. And a simple atom, when we think about an atom has three key components known as subparticles. And what are the three subparticles of an atom? Protons is one, neutrons is another, and an electron would be the third. And there are two ways that we can think about an atom. We can think about it the correct way, which is more complex, or we can think about it in the outdated way, which is a lot easier to understand. Considering that this is not a chemistry class, this is an anatomy class, we're going to go with the easy way, which is known as a Bohr model. And in a Bohr model, the protons and the neutrons are linked together in the nucleus of that atom. The electrons hover around the nucleus in what we refer to as a shell. Now, protons have what charge?
Positive.
These are positively charged. And a neutron
Neutral.
is neutral, so it's neither positive nor negative, which means that an electron is going to be negatively charged. And the one thing that's always true about an atom, always true about the atom, is that the number of protons is equal to the number of electrons. So if you have 2 protons, you have to have 2 electrons. 1 proton, you have to have 1 electron. And if the number of protons and the number of electrons, otherwise put, the number of positively charged subatomic particles and the number of negatively charged particles are equal to one another, what does that tell you about an atom's charge?
It's more unstable.
It's a good guess, but no.
It's gonna be, would it be more negative?
If you have 2 positive and 2 negative,
Neutral.
what's the overall charge?
Unstable.
There's no charge. So atoms are always neutral with regards to their charge. So if I was to tell you, I'm gonna give you atom X. You don't know what the atom is, but I tell you, this atom has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Can you make the Bohr model for me? Yeah, because you know that there's 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and if there's 2 protons, there has to be 2 electrons, right? Because they're always equal. So atoms, again, are going to be made up of 3 subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons, each with their own charge. Atoms are always going to be electrically neutral due to the fact that the number of protons will always be equal to the number of electrons. So the number of positively charged subatomic particles and the number of negatively subatomic particles are always going to be equal to one another. Therefore, the net charge of an atom is 0. It's neutral. But atoms have the ability to gain and lose electrons. We have the ability of getting rid of electrons or gaining electrons. We have the ability of an atom to share electrons. And in that is where we have the ability of allowing an atom to interact with other atoms to create compounds and molecules. And the creation of compounds and molecules, or the breaking apart of compounds and molecules, is where chemistry and the human body and anatomy ultimately get to play with one another. And again, here's an example of a Bohr model showing helium. Helium has 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 electrons. The protons and neutrons are going to be in the middle, or the nucleus of said atom. And then with the Bohr model's mentality, the electrons are going to be hovering in a shell surrounding the nucleus. Now, in any Bohr model, we have our protons and our neutrons in the nucleus. Electrons are going to hover in shells around it. And each of these shells can hold so many electrons. The first shell of any atom can hold how many total electrons? 2. So the first shell can hold a max of 2 electrons. After that first shell has 2 electrons, electrons will now move into a second shell. This second shell can hold a maximum of how many electrons? 8. I didn't do it evenly, but after 8, we will now create a third shell. Now, here's where we're going to go the simple route. The third shell can hold a maximum of what? Does anybody know the absolute correct answer? The third shell technically can hold 18. But, again, we're anatomy and physiology majors. So, we're going to call it 8 as well. And all of our models will still work. And with each of these layers, shells of electrons, the electrons, as they move further and further away from the nucleus, they become easier and easier to strip away or to do things with. So ultimately, when you're trying to decide whether or not an atom is going to be reactive or non-reactive, is it going to interact with other atoms or is it not going to interact with other atoms? What you ultimately need to look at is the outermost shell. And the outermost shell of any atom is known as the what shell? It's known as the valence shell. And to understand if an atom is going to react or not, you look at the outermost shell, this valence shell of electrons. If the outermost shell of electrons has a complete set of electrons, i.e., if the first shell is the outermost shell and it has 2 electrons, this atom is non-reactive, otherwise known as inert. So as we take a look at helium, helium has 2 electrons. Those electrons are in the first shell. The first shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. This atom will be non-reactive. It has no need to react because its outermost shell is filled with the maximum amount of electrons that that shell can hold. Does that make sense? On the other hand, if you took hydrogen, which has 1 proton, it has no neutrons, and it has 1 electron, this is hydrogen. Hydrogen is reactive because it needs 1 more electron in its first shell, does it not? It only has 1, and it can hold a maximum of 2. As a result, hydrogen will react with other atoms in order to try to complete its outermost shell of electrons. Does that make sense? And we're going to show you examples of reactive and non-reactive atoms here in just a second. So electrons are depicted, the more correct way is to depict them in a cloud, which is what we see here. So I put this in here not to confuse you. We're not going to use this model, but every semester I typically have the chemistry nerd in the house. And I always feel the need to make sure that chemistry does get its due. This is the more correct way to think about it. It's just more complex, and it doesn't really serve our needs, and it overcomplicates a topic, which ultimately we don't need to overcomplicate. We're going to complicate other chapters way more than they need to. Let's not complicate this one more than it has to. But ultimately, electrons, again, like I said, determine an atom's chemical behavior. If an atom rather is going to react or non-react with any other atoms in its environment, whether it's going to react or not is going to be determined solely by the electrons that it has surrounding its nucleus. The other things that we need to understand about an atom, we'll get back to this concept, there's 3 key identifying concepts for any atom. One of them is called the atomic number, the second one is called the atomic mass number, and the third one is the atomic weight. For this class, we're only going to be concerned with 2 of them. We're going to be concerned with the atomic number, and we're going to be concerned with the atomic mass number. The atomic number is simply defined as the number of protons an atom has. Simply put, so if you look up on the board here, hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. The reason why it has an atomic number of 1 is because it has 1 proton. That's its atomic number. It makes hydrogen unique from every other element on this periodic table. It's the only element with 1 proton. Right? Helium has an atomic number of 2. Because as we saw on this picture, helium has 2 protons. It's the only element with 2 protons. It's a unique identifier to helium. The atomic mass number, on the other hand, is equal to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Protons have weight. Neutrons have weight. If you put them on a scale, they physically weigh something. Right? Each proton weighs 1 atomic mass unit. Each neutron weighs 1 atomic mass unit. Electrons do have weight as well, but it's very, very, very small. So small that from an atomic mass number, especially for our perspective, they don't really count in its weight. So if you add the number of protons and the number of neutrons, you will get an atom's atomic mass number. So as we take a look at helium, helium would have an atomic mass number of what? 4, right? It has 2 protons, it has 2 neutrons, 2 plus 2 is 4, that's its weight. Those 2 key characteristics are going to be the 2 characteristics that we're going to be concerned with our discussion of chemistry. So again, as we take a look at 3 different atoms, hydrogen, helium, and lithium, hydrogen has 1 proton, it has 1 electron, it has an atomic number of 1. Its atomic mass number is also going to be 1 because it doesn't have any neutrons. Helium, 2 neutrons, 2 protons, 2 neutrons, 2 electrons. It'll have an atomic number of 2 and an atomic mass of 4. Lithium has 3 protons, has 4 neutrons, and 3 electrons. Its atomic number is 3 because it has 3 protons. Its atomic mass is 7, right? On the test, you do not have to memorize any elements. There's never going to be a time where on the test I'm going to say, what's the atomic mass of helium? That's not going to happen. You're not chemistry majors. But what I will do is I will say, lithium has 3 protons, 4 neutrons, and 3 electrons. What's its atomic mass? I will give you the ingredients. I will make sure that you understand the concept. Fair enough? Or I'll say something to the effect of atom X has 7 protons, 7 neutrons. How many electrons does it have? You should know that the number of protons and the number of electrons are equal. Does that make sense? I will give you the ingredients. I'm going to make sure you understand the concept. So please do not spend any quality time memorizing the protons, neutrons, and electrons of any element, because it will not be a worthwhile spending of your time for my class, or Anatomy 1 for that matter. Here are some examples of some other, I put this in, this is actually from the previous book that we were using for this class, but I like this picture. Your book doesn't offer a picture like this. I like this because it just gives you some other examples of elements, and it shows you the atomic number and the mass number, and so you guys can get a better grip of just seeing how this concept works. Everybody kosher with this concept? An isotope. An isotope is simply put is when we take an atom and we add neutrons to it. And if I add a neutron to an atom, what have I ultimately done to that atom? I've increased its atomic mass. I've made it heavier. Have I changed its charge? No. Why haven't I changed its charge? Because neutrons are neutral. So if I have something with 1 proton and 1 electron and I add a neutron to it, neutrons don't have a charge. So I haven't changed its positive or negative charge. It's still neutral, but the one thing it's heavier. So an isotope is when we make an atom heavier by adding neutrons to it. And there's a lot of reasons why we do this. In healthcare, the main reason why we like to add neutrons, well, here's an example. Here's hydrogen. We add an atom, we add a neutron to it, we turn it into H2 or deuterium. All right, this is just heavier. Tritium is if we add a second neutron to it. What we're doing is we're making hydrogen heavier. It's still hydrogen, because it's still a 1 proton atom. It's still a version of hydrogen, but now it's an isotope. The main reason in healthcare why we do this is to hopefully form a radioisotope. And we utilize in healthcare the concept of radioisotopes pretty regularly. A radioisotope is an isotope that gets so heavy that it becomes unstable. And when it becomes unstable, it splits apart. And when it splits apart, it creates energy. And we've learned in healthcare different ways of harnessing said energy to do something good. Can anybody think of 2 examples of healthcare related things where radioisotopes, or the creation of energy from breaking apart a radioisotope, is utilized?
CT and MRI.
Radio, not MRIs. MRIs are magnets. All right, so that's magnets. But the rest of it, yeah, all the other ones, yeah. PET scans, CT scans, X-rays, we're using radioisotopes to create an energy that we then turn into an image, right? So along the same vein, what would be the other one?
Chemo.
Chemo. More importantly, not so much chemo, although chemo a little bit, but more importantly, what's the other one? You got that chemo, I forgot that one. They put a machine to your chest, so they blast you with radiation. Radiation for cancer treatments. My grandmother had lung cancer, so we took her down to MD Anderson. MD Anderson said, look, this is stage 1. You know, we're going to take care of this. We're going to give her just some radiation. So they actually tattooed an X on my grandmother's chest, right? And every time that she went in to get treatment, they brought a machine straight to that tattooed X, because that represented where in the lung she had the cancer cells. And they blasted her with radiation. They did this 6 or 7 times. And after 6 or 7 radiation treatments, her cancer was so infinitesimally small that they couldn't detect it anymore. It was still there, but at 85, they said, well, look, by the time this grows back and becomes any kind of health risk to your grandmother, you'll die of something else, because you're 85, right? And sure enough, you know, she lived a few more years, and she died of kidney failure, but which had nothing to do with the lung cancer to begin with. So there's ways that we take this radioisotope concept in healthcare, and we've used it to our benefit. There's a negative to it, right? You don't want to get endless amounts of X-rays and CT scans and PET scans. But on the same token, we use them for diagnostic purposes or for the treatments of certain diseases, cancer being a good example. All right, so atoms. We could take atoms, and atoms, certain atoms are reactive, meaning that they're going to react and combine and connect with other atoms. And when they do so, they're either going to create something called a molecule, or they're going to create something called a compound. The difference between the two is actually pretty cut and dry. A molecule is when we combine 2 or more of the same element. So for example, if I take 2 hydrogen atoms, both of which are reactive, and I link them to one another in some way, shape, form, or fashion, I create a molecule called hydrogen gas, or H2. Compound, on the other hand, now we're combining 2 or more elements, but they're not the same. So for example, if I take 4 hydrogens, and I combine them with a carbon, I get CH4, which is otherwise known as methane, or methane gas. But because each of the components aren't the exact same component, we call this a compound. And to understand which elements are going to be reactive and which elements are not going to be reactive, again, what we need to do is we need to look at that outermost energy level, that outermost shell of electrons that an atom contains, that valence shell that we talked about before. If a valence shell, here we go. If a valence shell is holding the maximum amount of electrons that it can hold, that atom is unreactive, otherwise known as inert. It will not react with other atoms. If, on the other hand, the valence shell of electrons, that outermost shell of electrons of an atom, is not filled with its maximum amount of electrons, it is reactive. It will react with other atoms in order to try to make its outermost shell of electrons full. And once that happens, it will then create a compound, and it'll bond with other atoms and create these molecules or compounds that we talked about. So when, again, trying to determine if an atom is going to be reactive, you need to look at its outermost shell, this valence shell of electrons. So for example, here's an atom, helium. It has 2 valence shell electrons, 2 electrons in its outermost or valence shell. This atom is unreactive. If you take helium and you dump it into water, what do you get? Do you get helium water? No. What you get is a bubble of helium inside water, because helium does not react with anything. Neon. Valence shell has eight electrons. It's full. Neon does not react with any other atoms. All right? It's inert. These are inert elements. These are elements that will not react with anything else.
Are these the only two?
Oh, no. There's plenty of others. But these are just two very good examples. Yeah. But now, we'll take the simplest of all. Hydrogen. This is hydrogen. Doesn't have a neutron. It has one proton. It has one electron. Right? If you look at its outermost shell, which obviously is the first shell, it only has one electron. It's looking for a second one. Right? Or it's looking to get rid of this one, to be honest with you. This atom is reactive. This atom will react with other atoms around it to try to create bonds to meet its outermost shell. Or if I take, sodium. 11 protons, it has 11 electrons. How many electrons are in the valence shell? One. Is it trying to react or is it not trying to react? It's trying to react in a big way, and it will all day long, twice on Sundays. So these are going to be examples of atoms that are reactive due to the fact that their outermost shell is not a complete shell of electrons. It does not have a complete shell. And so when we find these types of atoms interacting with other atoms of a similar ilk, what we're going to see is that these atoms react with one another in a couple different ways. All right? And again, what we ultimately look for when we're trying to see if an atom is going to react or not is the rule is known as the rule of eights. And the rule of eights is the key to determining if an atom is reactive or not. Ultimately, if the outermost shell of any atom does not contain 8 electrons, with the exception of the first one, which can only hold 2, that atom is reactive. It's going to form compounds and molecules by interacting with other atoms in either in a couple of different types of bonding scenarios, which we're going to talk about here next. And so the rule of 8 is ultimately what determines whether or not an atom is reactive. And then when they react, we're going to do it in one of a couple different ways. And again, here's some examples of chemical reactive atoms. They gave you hydrogen. Down here is our sodium example. Here's oxygen with only 6 valence electrons. Carbon, which only has 4 valence electrons. Each of these atoms need to react with other atoms in order to try to stabilize themselves from a rule of 8 standpoint. Is everybody with me so far? Because the next step is showing you what happens when they react. All right, so there's 2 types of bondings. There's 2 key types of bondings. The first type of bonding is known as ionic bonding. In an ionic bonding, what happens is 2 atoms react with one another, and the way that they react with one another is one atom donates an electron, and the other atom takes the electron. So for example, you guys need to buy a soda at the machine, but you're 25 cents short. If I give you a quarter and you drink the soda, we're not sharing anything. I just gave you a quarter, correct? In ionic bonding, one atom gives another atom an electron. But in doing so, each of the 2 atoms will now meet their rule of 8 necessities. But here's the catch. If one atom gives an electron to another atom, what happens charge-wise to both atoms involved? I'll show you. So I'm going to simplify this just a little bit. So here's sodium with its 1 valence electron. right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2. And then here's chlorine. So this is sodium. Here's chloride. And chloride has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 valence electrons. How many does chloride need to meet the rule of 8? It needs 1. It has 7, right? It needs 1 more, right?
Sodium.
And sodium either needs 7, or if it gets rid of this 1, how many are in its valence shell? 8. With me? Because it gave away the 1 in that third shell. That third shell goes away now. Its new valence shell is this second one, which is already complete with 8, is it not? So if sodium gives chloride, do they not both now meet the rule of 8? Yes. Here's the rub though. Sodium, what happens to it if atoms are defined as having the same amount of protons and the same amount of electrons, and sodium just gave away an electron? It's no longer an atom, right? Because it no longer has the same number of protons and electrons, does it? It's now missing an electron. So what's going to happen to sodium?
It's going to turn into a different element.
It's going to turn into something called an ion, hence ionic bonding. And more importantly, what will it pick up from a charge perspective? It's going to be it's going to pick up a positive charge. Why?
Because it's missing an electron now, so it goes down.
Kinda. Well, here's the thing. It had before it donated its electron, it had 11 protons and 11 electrons.
Oh.
With me? Now it has 11 protons and how many electrons? 10. So does it have more positive electrons or more negative electrons?
Positive.
It has more positive electrons. I mean, it has more positive protons, rather. Right? So sodium will now pick up a positive charge. Fair enough? Chloride, on the other hand, does it now have 1 more electron or 1 more proton?
One more electron.
It has 1 more electron, and electrons are negatively charged, correct? So as a result, it will now pick up a negative charge. And if you take a positive and a negative, what do they do?
Cancel.
Oh no, not in this case. Opposites what?
Attract.
Attract. If you take a positive magnet and a negative magnet, what do? They stick to one another, do they not?
So then it's a compound?
So we've now created ultimately a compound, yes ma'am, because there's 2 different elements. But the key here is they're now attracted to one another by their negative charge. These two newly created ions, I've got a good picture of it here. All right, so here's sodium with its 11 electrons, 1 in its valence shell. Here's chlorine with its 7 valence electrons. Sodium gives an electron to chlorine. But in doing so, sodium now has 1 less electron than it does protons. Chlorine now has 1 more electron than it does protons. Because of the transfer of electrons, each of these atoms now picks up a charge, either positive or negative, depending on did it donate or did it receive that electron. And because they're now charged, they don't have the same amount of protons as they do electrons, they're no longer considered atoms, they're considered ions. And the positive ion of sodium and the negative ion of what's now chloride, opposites attract. And these 2 ions will now hover next to one another. Are they physically bonded? No. But these 2 ions are now connected by their different charges. And we refer to this as ionic bonding. It's a very weak bond, easily broken. Sodium chloride, which is what we've just created. Sodium chloride is a fancy way of saying what? Salt, table salt. Table salt is nothing more than sodium chloride, right?
So does this work if it's like you give 2 positive and 2 negative? It only works if you give the same numbers?
Oh yes, it's going to be the donation of one to another.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not like sodium donates 2 and chloride picks up 1, right? And then another chloride. That's the next bonding that we're going to talk about.
Oh.
Yeah. This is gonna be a 1-to-1 ratio kind of thing.
Okay, so just to simplify it, an ion is whenever the protons and electrons no longer equal each
equal.
other. Okay.
An ion, but a better way to define an ion. What you just said is true, but a better way to define an ion. An ion is what's created when an atom donates an electron to another atom, or an atom receives an electron from another atom. And in doing so, changes the equality between protons and electrons. Now they either have one more electron than proton, or they have one less electron than proton. And because of that, they're going to pick up either the positive charge or the negative charge. So sodium chloride is table salt, but table salt's actually a pretty weakly bonded structure. If you take a tablet of salt and you drop it into a glass of water and you just walk away, you come back an hour later, what do you have? You have salt water, right? Because the water has destroyed the sodium tablet. It's broken apart, this bond. This bond is a very weak bond, easily broken apart, but it's a bond nonetheless. Most of our ionic bondings are going to create crystallized type structures, our salt type structures. I have one more concept. And the names of these ions that are created, when an ion now picks up a negative charge, we refer to this as an anion. And the ion that picks up that positive charge is known as a cation. So for example, in this scenario where sodium donates to chlorine, sodium now becomes a cation, and chloride becomes an anion, because the cation is positively charged, the anion is negatively charged. So far, so good? The other key type of bonding is called the covalent bond. A covalent bond is different from an ionic bond in that instead of donating and receiving electrons, atoms now share their electrons. So a simple example of a covalent bond. Here's two hydrogen atoms. They both have one proton, they both have one electron. To meet the rule of 8, how many electrons does each of these two atoms need to pick up? 1, right? Because they already have 1, and this first shell can hold 2. Everybody with me? So if this hydrogen atom and this hydrogen atom shared their 1 electron, how many atoms would both of these atoms have in their valence shell? They both have 2, and it would look something like so. They're now both sharing their electron, and as a result, they now both have 2 electrons. Do they not? This is called a covalent bond. They're now physically sharing electrons. Is this going to create an anion and a cation? No, because none of the electrons were lost or gained. They were just shared, right? So as a result, both of these atoms now meet the rule of 8, because now they both have 2 valence electrons. And we've now bonded them. We've now physically bonded them to one another. This is going to be a much stronger bond than what we saw with the ionic bond. And we can share either 1, 2, or 3 pairs of electrons. If we share 1 electron, it's known as a single covalent bond. If we share 2 electrons, it's known as a double covalent bond. And if we share 3 electrons, it's known as a triple covalent bond. And the more electrons we share, the stronger the bond between the 2 atoms is.
Okay, I just have to say this. This sounds a lot like relationships. Like in the other one, it sounds like whenever people need other people and it's a weak bond, but as opposed to this little couple that have more in common.
It's funny you bring that up, because that's exactly how I used to teach it. I used to teach it in a relationship standpoint until it offended some student.
Oh.
Because somebody, I guess, was in a bad relationship, and she came to me, she's like, I don't like that. And she's like, I think that's a crap. I was like, no, whatever. Stop being a millennial. But 4 or 5 years ago, that's how I taught it. I would teach it with, you know, if you're with somebody because you just think they're attractive, that's an ionic bond, because it's a weak reason to be with somebody. But the more things you share in common, you know, you both like to fly fish, you both like to go to the movies, you both like, you know, this. The more things you have in common, the stronger your bond is. So I used to teach it in a very similar fashion. And again, there comes a point where you're just like, all right, it's not worth the headache. It's a good analogy, though.
I do
It's a
too.
very good analogy.
People are too sensitive.
The problem is, and I don't mean this, I'm sure all of you are fantastic people, but y'all's generation
Yes.
kind of pisses me off a little bit. I'm raising them, right? So, I mean, I've got a 20-year-old, so, and a 17-year-old, and I keep telling them, if you turn into one of those folks, I will disown you. Write me out of the will, you get nothing. Like, life sometimes just doesn't go your way, pull your britches up and move along. It's not somebody else's fault, just figure it out. So, here's some examples, but to your point, I completely concur with you. It's a very good way to think about it, at least in my opinion, and your opinion too. So, here are some examples of covalent bonds in action. Here's the one that I chose to use on the board, 2 hydrogen atoms. They both have 1 electron in their valence shell. That's the first shell, it can only hold 2. So if they share that 1 electron, now both of these atoms involved meet their rule of 8. They're gonna share that bond, that's a covalent bond. We're gonna write it like so, H, a single line and an H. This 1 line represents that there's a sharing of 1 electron. On the contrary, on the other hand, here's an example of a double covalent bond. Here we have oxygen with its 6 valence electrons. So each of these 2 oxygen atoms needs 2 electrons to meet the rule of 8, correct? So what they will do is share 2 of their electrons. Therefore, both of them now meet the rule of 8. Since they're sharing 2, we will write it this way. O, double line O. This double line represents that we are sharing 2 electrons.
Do they have to be the same elements?
No, it's coming. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's coming. But the easier way to understand the covalent bond is to see it in this form first, because then when we start adding other elements, we're going to muck it up a little bit. And then here, you can share 3 as well. I used to have a picture where they were sharing 3 electrons. To answer your question, no, they do not have to always be the same atom or element. And here's a good example. Here's carbon, which has 4 electrons in its outermost or valence shell, and 4 different hydrogens, each with 1 in their valence shell. If each of these hydrogens shares its electron with each of the 4 electrons in the carbon's outermost shell, this is what we'll get. And we refer to this as methane. This is CH4, and we would write it this way. Here's the C, and it's sharing 1 electron with each of the 4 hydrogens. Everybody's kosher with that concept.
Would this be a ionic or covalent?
Covalent all day long, twice on Sundays.
Because a lot of hydrogen separate.
Has nothing to do with what elements are involved. It has to do with how the elements are linking to one another. Because again, this is all about how they're sharing their electrons. All right? In an ionic bond, hydrogen, in this particular scenario, hydrogen would have given carbon its electron and become positively charged, and carbon would have become negatively charged, right? In a covalent bond, no one's giving anyone anything. They're sharing it, all right? So for example, go to this scenario where you're buying a soda at the machine, but you're a quarter short. If I throw you a quarter, it's a hit, and then you drink the whole soda, all right, I'm out a quarter, so I'm negative, you're up a quarter, you're positive. I don't get any benefit of the soda. In a covalent bond, I give you 50 cents, you throw in 50 cents, and we split the soda equally. Everything's shared. With me? So in a covalent bond, they're linking together. There's a physical bond between them because they're sharing the electrons. In an ionic bond, there's no physical link. They're close to one another due to the fact that we've now created a negative and a positive ion. And opposites attract, just like two magnets, and they will link to one another that way. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, here's the problem with covalent bonding. Covalent bonding comes in two very, very key forms. The first form is known as nonpolar. And what we're seeing right here is a very, very good example of a nonpolar covalent bond. In that, when you take a look at carbon with its 4 valence electrons, and you look at hydrogen with each of its 1 valence electron, the one thing we notice is that when you look at the valence shell of all 5 atoms involved, are there any extra electrons? Are there any unshared electrons? No. Everything has been shared nice and clean and perfect, right? Hydrogen has no extra, carbon has no extra on their valence shells, correct? And as a result of that, does this molecule or this compound, pick up a charge? No, it's neutral. And as a result, non-covalent bonds are going to create neutral molecules and as we look back at some of the other examples, all right, here's oxygen. Are there extra electrons? Yes. But here's the thing. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 on this atom, and 1, 2, 3, 4 on this atom. So have they equally shared their electrons? Yes. Because each of them now has the same. There's no disparity between these two sides, is there? No. Or we come down here to hydrogen gas. All of these electrons were shared equally. So as a result, these atoms or these new compounds and molecules that are created are neutral. They don't pick up a charge. And if they're neutral and don't pick up a charge, they're going to be inert. And what does inert mean?
They're not reactable.
They're not going to react with anything else, right? So if you take methane gas and you put it into an environment with all kinds of other atoms and molecules, methane gas is not going to react in any way, shape, form, or fashion with anything else. It's complete, it's done, it's happy, it has no need to react.
This is the married.
Hmm?
They're married.
This is a
Sorry.
happily married couple. Ma'am,
So are covalent bonds always going to be inert?
excuse me?
Are covalent bonds always going to be inert?
Oh, heck no. Oh, heck no.
Uh-oh.
That's coming next. Can I erase this?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, this is the polar.
So now we come to the other type of covalent bond to answer her question, which is a polar covalent bond. If a nonpolar covalent bond means that they equally shared their electrons, therefore they're inert and non-reactive, there should be easy common sense to tell you that in a polar covalent bond, the opposite is true. So, a good example and the quintessential, the best example of this is going to be water. So when we think about the greatest example, especially from an A&P perspective of a covalently bonded molecule that is polar, water is the best example. So here's hydrogen. We all know that water is what? H2O, right? So we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, right? I guess I like water because it looks like Mickey Mouse. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. So for it to be covalently bonded, it needs to pick up 2 more, correct? And when we create water, we pick up one hydrogen for one of them and another hydrogen for the other. Hydrogen, does it have any leftover electrons? No. Oxygen, does it have any leftover electrons? Yes. It has 4 electrons over here. What do we think occurs as a result of those 4 electrons not being bonded with anything and not being counteracted by any extra electrons on the hydrogen atoms?
Everything's gonna be.
Doesn't change its shape.
Is everything gonna try to connect with it, or it's gonna try to connect with everything?
Yes. Why?
Because they.
Wouldn't it react, will still be able to react?
All day long, twice on Sundays. The question is why? Don't get me wrong, what you both said is 100% correct, you just haven't answered the question of why.
It wants to get full.
The room.
Nope, it doesn't need any more electrons. It's up, look, rule of 8, rule of 8, rule of 8. Matt, they're golden. Rule of 8 is not the answer.
Is it because it's negatively charged?
There you go. It's gonna pick up a charge, right? This side of the molecule will have a negative charge because it has extra electrons. This side of the molecule will be positively charged because it doesn't have any extra electrons. So now what we've created is a molecule, a compound, that's covalently bonded, strong bond, and now it has a charge. Half of it's positive, half of it's negative. With me? So if we take this water molecule and we combine it with our weakly bonded table salt, here's our ionic bond, and here's our covalent bond. What happens when we add water to sodium chloride? You just told me the answer. I told you, if I take a tablet of salt and I dump it into a glass of water and you walk away and you come back an hour later, what do you get? And everybody here said, oh, you get salt water, which is right. But why do you get salt water?
Because they've reacted.
Because sodium chloride reacted with water. But how did it react with water?
Because you said earlier that salt water, not the salt is unstable.
I didn't say it was unstable. I said it was weak.
Oh, yeah, that.
Yeah.
And then mixed with the 4 extra.
Right. Covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds. This is a very weak bond. So when sodium chloride, table salt, meets water, what do you think the sodium is attracted to?
The opposite.
The oxygen side of this molecule. And the chloride, what do you think it's attracted to? The hydrogen. And because covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds, sodium chloride breaks apart. We literally tear that bond apart. And now what we get is salt water. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the reason why water is so important is because we use water for almost everything in our body. Any reaction that we take, all of our fluids, name a fluid in the body, its primary component is water. Blood, cerebral spinal fluid, saliva, whatever it might be. It's primarily made up of water, and the one thing we love about water in our body is it's so darn reactive. And the reason why it's so reactive and the reason why it does so much good in our body is because it is polar, it's a polar covalent bond. It's a strong bond that's ultimately created in a way where we have an inequity between the sharing of electrons, and so it picks up 2 charges, half of it's positive, half of it's negative. So when water mixes with other things, it rumbles with it. It's like, all right, let's go. It's go time. It breaks things apart. We use it for so many different things in the body. We're going to see that concept throughout the semester. So in a polar covalent bond, the electrons are not shared equally between the atoms of a molecule. So as a result, that molecule will pick up a positive side and a negative side like we see with water. And the best example, especially from our perspective, is water. So here's our water molecule with its oxygen and its 2 hydrogens. Because there's 4 extra electrons, this side will take a negative charge. The hydrogen side will take a positive charge. And when this molecule, when this compound meets weaker ionically bonded structures, it will break them apart. And we like that. We use it to our advantage on a regular basis.
Food. Like that?
Absolutely.
Alright.
When you think about why saliva does its job, one of the key things that saliva does is it breaks things down because it's primarily made up of water, and it dissolves things because that water in the saliva mixes with whatever we put in our mouth and starts to slowly break it down. The last type of bond is known as a hydrogen bond. And a hydrogen bond is a very, very weak chemical bond that exists between two polar covalently bonded structures. So if I take one water molecule, so if I take two water molecules with their slightly positive and negative sides, and I connect them with one, and I put them in the same environment with one another, the positive side of the water molecule, of one water molecule, will be attracted to the negative side of the other, and vice versa. Will this break apart water? No, because covalent bonds and covalent bonds don't break apart covalent bonds. But now what they'll do is, just like we saw in the ionic bond, they'll be attracted to one another. This is what ultimately gives water its tension. Right? If you ever think about water and you see little bugs flitting on the surface and you wonder how can that bug stay on the surface of the water, I'm sure that's something you guys lay up at night wondering why. But if you ever did wonder it, this is why. Water has surface tension. The reason why it has surface tension is because the water molecules that are making up that pond or lake or river, whatever you're looking at, ultimately those water molecules connect to one another in a hydrogen bond, as the positive side of one water molecule is attracted to the negative side of the other, and it creates surface tension. Now, if you ever watch the Olympics, right, and you're looking at Michael Phelps as he's swimming through the water, and as he kind of comes up, the water kind of follows his face for a second. Well, the tension in that water is enough to kind of follow his face until it finally breaks. Water tension, surface tension is caused by hydrogen bonding. Before we move on to the next part of this chapter, it gets significantly easier. Before we move on, does anybody have questions with atoms, ionic bonding, or covalent bonding? We're all good? Fair enough. So with regards to all this bonding stuff we're talking about, the body, now we'll talk a little bit more about some intro to anatomy. The body does a series of reaction types, and there's, depending on the book that you read, your book talks about three types of reactions. One's called an exchange, one is called decomposition, and the third one is called a synthesis reaction. And on a regular basis, our body is constantly undergoing these types of reactions. And the way we do this is by either breaking apart or putting together, either creating molecules and compounds or breaking apart molecules and compounds, so that our body then can do things with said components for the body's benefit. In a synthesis reaction, what does synthesis mean? If I synthesize something, what do I do?
Summarize.
I don't like the word add, although I think I know where you're going. If I told you that this is a synthetic drug, what does that mean?
Making a fake copy of it.
It's man-made. Some man made it. So synthesis, when you see the word synthesis, I want you to think make or create something. We're actually building something. So the simple mathematical equation for a synthesis reaction would be A plus B equals AB. We're taking component A, we're taking component B, and we're turning it into compound AB. I'm taking a hydrogen atom, link them together, and I'm creating hydrogen gas, H2. And we do this in the body all the time. A good example is if we take amino acids, right? So here's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, right? We have all these different components, and we link them together to create one long chain. The simple component of a protein is called an amino acid. When we link them all together, we create a protein. So A plus B equals AB. Right? So if we take amino acids, link them together, we get a protein. If we take a bunch of simple sugars, link them together, we get something known as a polysaccharide. The converse of this is called the decomposition reaction. This is when we take a larger compound and we break it apart into its more simplistic components. So if we take compound AB and we break it down into A plus B, this is known as a decomposition reaction. What's great about this is it releases energy, and the energy that can be used in the body for good. The example that your book uses, which is a very good example, is if we take a long, this is a polysaccharide known as glycogen. Glycogen is ultimately our stored form of sugar. And we break it apart into all of its individual components. These are each glucose molecules. So AB is broken down into A plus B. Simple enough, right? The third of them, which is probably the most complex of them all, is known as an exchange reaction. And in an exchange reaction, this type of thing is occurring. We're taking compound AB and compound CD, we're turning it into AC plus BD. And for an exchange reaction to occur, decomposition and synthesis need to occur. So the first thing we have to do is break this into A plus B plus C plus D. And then from there, we can then link AC and BD to one another. So the first thing we have to do is decompose, and then what we have to do is resynthesize. And we do this all the time in the body as well. The example that your book uses is something called ATP. Right, ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is how our cells utilize energy. If we mix that with a glucose molecule, we can donate a phosphate group to glucose. So to do that, we have to decompose adenosine triphosphate and get rid of its phosphate molecule, and then reattach it to glucose. We refer to this as an exchange reaction. And we're going to see examples of these as we go through the semester. Right now, I don't need you to know the specifics. I need you to know the concepts. All right, so the book now goes into its second half. The first half is all the basic chemistry stuff. The second half of this chapter, we now start talking a little bit more about either organic or inorganic compounds. So now we're getting into a little bit more of a complex chemistry, otherwise known as biochemistry. And biochemistry is the chemical composition of living matter, which obviously we are, and obviously we're going to be spending all semester talking about living matter. Inorganic compounds are compounds that lack carbon. All right, so they do not have carbon. There are two examples, and there are two examples of inorganic compounds that do contain carbon. Can anybody tell me what they are? Anybody remember from like high school chemistry?
What's the question?
There are two inorganic compounds that contain carbon. All the rest of them don't. Can anybody tell me the two that are inorganic compounds that have carbon in them? The first one is carbon monoxide, and the other is carbon dioxide. These are both inorganic, and they do contain carbon. Other than these two, all inorganic compounds lack carbon. They tend to be small, simple molecules, and there are four varieties when we're thinking about inorganic compounds. We have our acids, we have our bases, we have our salts, and we have water. And we're only going to have time to talk about water, and then we'll deal with the rest of it on Tuesday of next week. Organic compounds, on the other hand, if you think about organic compounds, these all contain carbon. They're going to be larger, covalently bonded molecules. And when we think about organic compounds, now we're talking about carbohydrates, we're talking about fats and lipids, we're talking about proteins, we're talking about nucleic acids, we're talking about larger compounds in the body. And we won't get to those today because I'm running out of time already. So we start with inorganic, And the last thing we'll talk about here in lecture before we go into lab is the concept of why we love water so much. Everybody always tells you, you gotta drink lots of water, the body's made up of 75% water, all these things you hear about water, 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 water. And water is a great compound. We love water, we need water, and we utilize water in a sundry of different ways to benefit us as human beings. And when we think about the properties of water that make it so fantastic, there's a handful of things that water does for us which are really important to understand. The first one is water has something known as a high heat capacity, which means that water can absorb and release large amounts of heat before it changes the temperature of the organism that it's contained within. This concept is what makes us what? My son Benjamin has a bearded dragon, right? Everybody knows what a bearded dragon looks like, about yay long. He sits in a cage all day long, boring life. What do we have to provide this bearded dragon with for him to survive other than food and water? Light. I have to give him a heat source. Why? Because he's cold-blooded. He can't control his body temperature. His body temperature is determined directly by the environment that he's in, right? So if my house is set at 70 degrees, Mike is at 70 degrees. If my house is set at 150 degrees, Mike is 150 degrees, right? Are we that same way? No. We are what? We're warm-blooded. What does that actually mean? What does warm-blooded mean? It means we set our own body temperature. We have the ability of determining what our body temperature is going to be. And one of the key ways, if not the key way that we do that, is by utilizing a very important property of water, which is its high heat capacity. The fact that water can absorb heat and release heat without changing our body temperature is what gives us the ability to maintain a steady body temperature. It prevents us from having sudden changes in body temperature. Otherwise, if you go to Vegas in the middle of July when it's 115 in the shade, you will become 115 degrees and die. Or if you go to Alaska in February, you will lose body temperature rapidly and equally die. But we don't do that. We get colder, we get warmer, but it's much more subtle. And that's because water has the ability of absorbing and releasing heat.
So would that mean that the large amount of water in our bodies help us maintain homeostasis?
Darn tootin'. The second thing that's great about water is it has a high heat of vaporization. What this means is that if we release water and it evaporates off of our body, each droplet of water that evaporates from our body, along with it, releases a significant amount of heat, which is why sweating is such an effective way of what?
Cooling down.
Cooling our body down. And retaining water is a really good way of doing what? Heating our body up, right? If it's hot as heck outside, I sweat. If it's hot outside, Mike doesn't sweat. My son's lizard doesn't sweat. He just gets hotter. If it's cold in my house, he's not retaining water from a heat perspective. He's just getting colder, right? But because we can release large amounts of heat, we can help to control or cool our body by sweating. Sweating water out helps us to cool our body down. Water is also important for the body because it has a polar solvent property. We just went over how water is a polar covalent bond, meaning that when it's created, it has a positive and a negative end, correct? Well, that positive and negative end we use to our advantage, right? We use it as our universal solvent. What is a solvent?
Is it a solvent?
That's a solver. No, not a solvent. A solvent is something that dissolves something else,
Oh.
right? If you all had a mother like me, your mother at least one time in your life licked her thumb and smeared it on your face, right? And if you didn't, ask your mom why, because all moms do it. It's a classy old learn, right? But why does water work so well at removing dirt or doing things in the body? It's because it's a polar covalent bonded compound. And as a result, we use water in the body to break down large products into smaller products. We use it as the base for literally every liquid in the body, all right? And because The reason why water is the main component of every liquid in the body is because it has this polar covalent bonded structure. It has that positive and negative end, and it reacts with other things, and it breaks things down for us. Which moves into the next concept, which is that it's chemically reactive. We use water in most of our chemical reactions in the body. We either deprive something of water or we add water to something in order to get different reactions to take place in the body. We use it for cushion. All right, think about your spinal fluid. All right, the key function of cerebral spinal fluid, which surrounds our brain and surrounds our spinal cord, is it creates a watery cushion for our brain and for our spinal cord. All right, helps to keep it buoyant. Everybody kosher with that concept? All right, so that's enough torture for the morning. In lab today, did everybody bring gloves?
No.